Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
My dad raised his glass at my birthday dinner and, with the unhurried swagger of a man who believes the room is stitched together for his comfort, declared that the true success in our family was my younger sister Lauren. Which prompted the kind of laughter that doesn't arrive because anything is funny, but because people are trying to prove they're on the winning side of a moment, and I kept smiling the way you learn to smile when you have spent years being useful rather than visible. Until Jason, my boss, who had agreed to swing by for a plate and a handshake, set his fork down with surgeon calm and said it was strange to make that toast since Lauren had applied for a job with him last week. And in the split second before anyone breathed, I watched the pride drain out of my father's face, as if someone had tugged the plug on a bathtub full of warm self-regard. The restaurant had that curated nostalgia of framed celebrity photos and dim lighting meant to flatter people who don't want to be surprised by their reflections. The kind of place where the servers remember your name because it is printed in heavy black marker on the reservation card. And while Dad recovered with a throat clear and a helpless glance toward the dessert menu, Lauren flicked her eyes toward me in a panicked math problem that ended, as it always does, with the answer that everything embarrassing must somehow be my fault, though Jason had not looked at me at all, which was its own tidy verdict, and Mom sipped water like it might turn into a shield if she held it long enough. I excused myself for a work call, the phone lighting exactly when I had scheduled it to, because preparing for humiliation is a skill set nobody brags about, but many of us carry like a pocket knife. And I stepped into the hallway where the carpet was too soft and the sconces made everyone look a little saintly, opened my recording app. Yes, I had started it at appetizers, and you are allowed to disagree with me about that, and breathed out once. Long and quiet, before Lauren's heels clicked up behind me and she hissed that I must have told Jason, which I hadn't because he reads his own email and also enjoys the clean edge of truth sharpened by timing, at which point I held up my phone and said I was recording myself, not her. A sentence that is both accurate and an invitation to behave better. Back at the table I slid into my seat, counted to 3 the way I do before I say anything that will live in someone's memory, and when the server asked about desserts I said we had brought a cake, which I had indeed stashed in my trunk because hope is a plan. And when he lifted the lid my quiet, petty masterpiece appeared, lemon curd, which I love and Lauren hates, iced with a message that read, "To quiet work that looks like luck," a line that made Mom's smile real for 1 second and made Dad laugh like he understood even though he did not, while Jason glanced at his vibrating phone at the exact same instant mine buzzed with the harmless email I had scheduled to HR, confirming receipt of all materials for applicant Lauren Hart, a freeze, not a rejection, because sometimes silence does more precise work than a push. If you think I am cruel, I hear you, because I also hear me, and I have spent years choosing the high road only to discover it circles the same mountain. So tonight I chose a stairwell, and while we cut the cake I let Dad ask about my work call. Answered that it was nothing urgent, only context, which told him everything and nothing at the same time, and then Jason leaned just close enough for only me to hear and asked if I was sure I wanted where this goes, and I told him I was sure I was done not wanting it, which is a different animal. The bill arrived and Mom did her fairness ritual, split checks, measured gratitude, the arithmetic of peacekeeping, while Lauren returned from the restroom with the public face polished and the private one still dripping on the tile. And I kept my hands still because gloating is just an admission with worse manners, then stood to leave, the recording app still running like a small red conscience, and felt the night change shape from birthday to experiment, from family dinner to audit, from me as the soft landing to me as the person who decides whether we land at all. In the parking lot's soft neon, Jason idled at the curb like a question mark and I waved him on because I needed to walk the length of the block with my own pulse before I said anything smart or stupid. But I'd barely taken 10 steps when Mom's hand found my elbow, that featherlight seatbelt she has used since I was 5, and she asked, not with the tremble of someone afraid of the answer, but with the steadiness of someone who has collected too many half-truths, whether there was more she should know, and I looked at her and saw the woman who has kept weather off this family like a roof and realized I was about to move a load-bearing wall. Here is your hook, and it is not subtle. Yes, there is more. There has always been more, and while Lauren thinks the danger is that I might expose her, the real danger is that I might stop protecting the family story that made her the star and me the stagehand. Because once you stop lifting the backdrop, the audience can see the raw wall behind it, and when that happens, people either rebuild or they keep pretending the paint is sky. Inside the restaurant, Dad was still trying to staple his toast back together with jokes, and Lauren was calculating whether she could convince Jason that ambition counts as experience, and my phone, red dot glowing, held the whole night like a borrowed fuse, and I had not yet decided whether to light it or to throw it away. Which is why when Mom whispered, "Tell me now," I said, "Tomorrow early, I'll bring coffee, no sugar," and she nodded because she knew I remembered, while I turned my face toward the street where a different kind of birthday candle was burning, quiet and hot, and promised myself that before dessert plates were washed I would set the first small consequence in motion and make it look like mercy. Morning arrived with the kind of hush that follows a night where every word had weight, and I drove to my parents' house through streets still yawning themselves awake, while I rehearsed the shape of the conversation I had promised my mother. Because if there is one thing I am good at, it is making a plan that can carry both truth and fallout without snapping in the middle. And when she opened the door in her robe with the belt tied twice for safety, I held up the paper tray with 2 coffees and a bag of bagels like an offering to the deities of domestic peace, then followed her to the kitchen where the legal pad she uses when she wants to look organized lay waiting beside a pen she pretends not to care about even though it is her favorite. She didn't ask how I slept because we both know sleep is not what happens after a dinner like that. She simply said context in the careful tone of a nurse about to peel back a bandage. And I set the canvas of our family on the table and began painting in the parts nobody frames, telling her that Lauren's highlight reel works because there is always a hidden crew, neighbors who finish the fundraiser before the glossy post, coworkers who iron the wrinkled timeline after the triumphant caption. And, most consistently, me, the person who does the quiet stitching and then disappears while the dress gets applause, so that when Dad says true success, what he is measuring is volume rather than value. And although I can love him for trying to be proud, I am no longer willing to be measured with his broken ruler. Mom listened without the performative nodding she uses in company, just the small breaths of a woman who wants to keep both daughters and also wants to stop lying to herself, and when I told her I had already nudged Lauren's application into a dignified pause. No blacklisting, no spectacle, simply a freeze that would keep her from sprinting through a door she had not earned while the family still believed she floated on air. My mother's shoulders lowered in relief and guilt at the same time. Because she is a peacekeeper by habit and a realist by birth, and those two species rarely mate without producing a fight. By late morning, my father came in from golf with that glow he gets from winning against men who look like him, and after kissing the space above my hair, he said the line he always says when he wants credit for being egalitarian, proud of both my girls. Then pivoted to a monologue about Lauren's client deck, which he framed like a championship while implying that my work is important the way oxygen is important, meaning you never talk about it unless it fails, and although I could have argued I took a different route because arguments are fireworks and what I wanted was architecture, so I slid my phone across the table with a draft email open and asked him if he would be willing to tell Jason, in his own voice, but with my words, that the client retention system that saved a contract last quarter was designed and implemented by me alone, and that the team relies on it daily, and he hesitated, not because it wasn't true, but because saying it out loud would tilt the family's myth, then. Slowly, he typed and pressed send, which did not solve anything but did place one steady stone in a very wobbly bridge. After he left the room to investigate the pantry like it might contain a trophy, I set the second piece of my small, polite revenge in motion. Opening the family group chat where Mom had posted an old 4th of July photo with matching shirts and bangs that should be illegal, and writing a caption that wore the tone of nostalgia while carrying the weight of correction. Remember when Lauren won Young Entrepreneur at the neighborhood fair for selling lemonade I made, with a smiling face made only of punctuation and a little lemonade icon swapped for a word because I know the rules about numbers and I am also stubborn about symbolism, then watching the responses tumble in a cascade of laughter and hearts and that familiar "we were a team" Line from Lauren that turns invisible labor into a family brand, which I let sit without reply because the point was not to fight. The point was to adjust the story by a degree that would matter over distance. In the afternoon, Mom called from the upstairs hallway, voice lowered even though we were alone, to tell me Jason had invited us to a company mixer that would showcase client centricity and operational rigor the way fancy hors d'oeuvres showcase butter, and that he had mentioned both daughters by name while pointedly asking that Dad not be told yet, which thrilled and terrified her in equal measure because she knows Jason likes experiments and our family is very flammable, and I said we would go and that I would bring Lauren myself because sometimes the cleanest way to end a pattern is to walk it into a room with better lighting and see what survives. Evening unspooled into that amber hour where thoughts get honest, and just as I was considering whether silence could be a kindness or merely a delay tactic, my phone lit with an unknown number, and I let it ring once to feel my own pulse before answering, only to hear a woman with a cool, professional voice introduce herself as Kara from a talent firm that handles discreet checks for executives who prefer their mirrors polished, and she said my name had been provided as someone who had worked closely with Lauren on multiple campaigns, and would I be willing to speak to her problem-solving approach and reliability under tight timelines, which told me two things at once: that someone, perhaps not Jason, had placed me in a position where honesty could sound like betrayal, and that whatever came next would require a precise kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like a very calm sentence. The call with Kara hung in the air long after the line went dead, her voice crisp and professional, yet carrying the weight of an unspoken demand that I define my sister in sentences sharp enough to pierce, but smooth enough not to look like malice. And I stood in the silence of my apartment with the phone still warm in my hand, knowing that honesty, when uttered to strangers who hold the keys to opportunity, can so easily masquerade as sabotage. I had told her Lauren excelled at stepping into a conversation precisely when it became visible, that she was dazzling in presentation and magnetic in community settings, but that she struggled with the bridge between vision and delivery, which I framed as aspirational with timelines, a phrase that sounded polite yet carved its meaning with a scalpel, and though I hung up without a tremor in my voice, I could feel the faint taste of guilt creep in, because what I had done was not slander but truth spoken at a moment when truth might harm, and sometimes that feels worse. Almost immediately Jason texted to ask if Kara had called, and when I confirmed she had, he responded with a question mark, which struck me as unusual, because Jason is a man who deals in statements, not in punctuation that trails off like an ellipsis. And when I pressed him on whether he had arranged it, his answer was a clean no, leaving me to wonder who had placed me in that role, because Lauren certainly wouldn't risk naming me if she believed I'd undercut her, and Dad lacked the subtlety to insert my name in a process like this, so either someone else was playing a game, or the universe was making sure I could no longer stand at the edges pretending neutrality. Dinner that evening at my parents' house was staged with the usual props, takeout cartons spreading steam across the table, Dad narrating highlights of the back nine as though they were world history, and Mom watching the conversation like a referee whose whistle has long since cracked. But then, as inevitably as thunder follows lightning, Dad shifted the spotlight onto Lauren's client meeting, describing it as if she were closing billion-dollar deals instead of freelancing for a friend's boutique brand, and he turned to me with the smile he uses when he thinks he's balancing the scales, saying that I was the rock, that every team needs a rock, which landed like a compliment wrapped in a gravestone. This was where I decided a small correction was overdue, so I angled my phone toward him with an email draft visible, telling him Jason needed confirmation about the client retention system that had renewed our largest contract, and I suggested that, since he wanted to be part of my professional narrative, he could simply write that I had designed and implemented it alone and that the team relied on it, and although he hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Mom for silent permission, he eventually tapped the words and pressed send, each keystroke slow, reluctant, but undeniable, and in that moment my father unknowingly offered public acknowledgement that had been withheld for years. The next day's mixer at Jason's company gleamed with chrome and glass, as though ambition itself had built the walls, and as we entered I could feel Dad swelling with pride at the thought that Jason had recognized Lauren's supposed brilliance, while Mom's eyes kept flicking toward me, aware that the room itself was a stage set for something more complex than networking. Jason greeted us with careful neutrality, the same steady tone he uses whether announcing layoffs or promotions, and then steered us into a circle where small cards with slogans like client centricity and operational rigor sat on cocktail tables like fortune cookies for the ambitious. Lauren, radiant in a white blazer, gravitated toward brand story, as if the universe had labeled her table for her, while I drifted to rigor, my father positioning himself proudly near centricity, thinking it was a word out of golf. A woman named Becca, a product manager with the kind of sharpness that cuts through jargon, clapped for attention and announced a live case round, no slides, just quick thinking, and Lauren, never one to miss a spotlight, volunteered first, spinning a tale of vision, momentum, and North Stars, which dazzled in sound but floated above ground like a hot air balloon without ballast. Then Becca looked around for someone to anchor the story in operations, and Jason's eyes landed on me with that tiny flick that said he had already decided, so I stepped forward and laid out a plan with specifics. Choose a single region, define one measurable, run daily stand-ups, kill loudly if it failed, duplicate if it worked, and document every lesson so nothing vanished into memory. And the room nodded, not because I was poetic, but because survival tends to earn agreement. Lauren smiled tightly, pretending we were a duet, while inside she burned at the juxtaposition of her gloss and my gravity. The evening wore on with mingling and polite laughter, but before the crowd dispersed, Jason touched my elbow and asked quietly whether I would ever consider stepping into the role Lauren had applied for, noting that, in his eyes, I was already performing it. And though my face remained neutral, my chest tightened with the recognition that the game I had tried to avoid was now unfolding in public, where consequences were unavoidable. By the time we left, Dad was still talking about Lauren's natural shine, oblivious to the recalibration happening in front of him, while Mom's silence pressed against me like a weight, and Lauren, smiling for the lobby camera, whispered in my ear not to embarrass her, which might have been funny if it weren't so perfectly ironic, given that the spotlight she adored was about to turn into the very heat that could expose her limits. The mixer had already begun to feel less like a networking event and more like a carefully staged experiment by the time Jason returned from the small group huddles and directed us into a brighter conference space, where the walls gleamed with framed patents and motivational slogans, as though ambition itself had been laminated and hung up as decor. The earlier case round had drawn a clear line between my sister's style and mine, her buoyant abstractions versus my grounded specifics, and although no one had said it aloud, the air in the room had shifted. And people now glanced at me the way you look at the person who just quietly stopped the leak in a boat without demanding applause. Jason, ever the master of neutrality, leaned close enough for only me to hear and asked, in a voice stripped of ceremony, whether I would consider stepping into the very role Lauren had applied for, telling me that, in his view, I was already doing the work. I gave him the practiced half-smile of someone who has spent years deflecting with composure, but inside I felt the strange pulse of vindication and dread colliding, because accepting what was being offered meant not only exposing Lauren, but also dismantling the mythology that held our family together. Across the room, Lauren was glowing, as though nothing had happened at all, weaving herself into a circle of young managers with the confident rhythm of someone who knows how to perform enthusiasm like choreography, while Dad lingered nearby, shoulders squared, grinning with paternal pride as if every approving nod directed toward her were an endorsement of his own judgment. Mom, however, kept her eyes trained on me, a subtle signal that she knew what was unfolding beneath the sheen, and I felt the old tug between self-preservation and preservation of family peace, a tug that had defined too much of my adult life. Becca, the product manager who had orchestrated the earlier exercise, stepped forward again and announced a second round. This time a role-play of an escalation with an angry client who had threatened to pull a major contract after a product update broke their workflow. Volunteers were asked to simulate how they would handle the call, and, true to form, Lauren was first to raise her hand, striding into the circle with a dazzling smile, her voice warm with empathy as she spoke a vision of how the company valued relationships, of how trust could be rebuilt with dialogue. It was a performance polished to perfection, and for a few minutes I thought she might actually land it, until the client, played by Becca, asked what specific steps would be taken in the next 48 hours to stabilize operations, at which point Lauren faltered, repeating vague phrases about exploring options and activating ambassadors, language that sounded elegant but was empty to anyone who had ever been on the other end of a crisis. Jason's eyes flicked toward me again, and before I even spoke I knew what was expected, so I raised my hand and said I would take the escalation from support. I laid out a response that began with accountability, acknowledging the failure without hiding behind jargon, then promised 3 concrete measures within 48 hours, a temporary rollback behind a toggle to restore the old workflow, a micro-demonstration of the intended flow with a form for capturing edge cases, and a weekly change log written in clear, non-technical English. I concluded by giving the client direct access to me if those promises were not met, bypassing the portals and tickets that so often serve as shields rather than tools, and I could feel the relief settle over the room. Not because my words were poetic, but because they were actionable, and action is the one currency people will always trust more than charm. The applause was light but genuine, the kind that comes from people who know what it feels like to be saved from a spiraling situation, and Jason nodded once, his version of endorsement, while Becca remarked that brand storytelling lands better when paired with operational rigor, an observation that outwardly praised us both, but inwardly drew a contrast sharp enough for everyone to see. Lauren forced a smile and pretended we were partners in a duet, but her eyes were tight, the kind of tightness that comes when applause no longer feels safe. During the mingling that followed, Mom approached me with a tentative softness, her voice low so no one else could hear, and told me I had been good, that I had always been good, though the words carried both pride and regret, as if she were apologizing for not saying them sooner. I told her I wasn't trying to humiliate Lauren, that all I wanted was to stop being embarrassed for existing, and she nodded with a weary understanding, asking me hypothetically, if Jason were to offer me something, would I take it? And I answered honestly that I might, but that I would not tell Dad first, because his approval was not the condition anymore. Later, as the evening drew to a close, I found Lauren near a hallway lined with glass cases, and I told her I would help her prove herself if she wanted, explaining that I would send her a scenario the next day, giving her 24 hours to prepare and present a plan to Jason and Becca with no slides and no outside assistance, and that if she succeeded I would personally call HR to move her application forward. She studied me with narrowed suspicion, then cautious hope, asking what the catch was, and I told her simply that the only condition was she could not call me for help. Her laugh was brittle, and she accused me of setting trapdoors beneath her stage, but I reminded her that she had asked for a stage, and gravity is not mine to control. When we left the building that night, Dad was still humming with pride, convinced that Lauren had charmed the room, while Mom remained quiet, her hand brushing mine in a silent acknowledgement that the balance of things had shifted. Jason shook my hand at the curb and reminded me to think about what we had discussed, but his eyes told me the decision had already been made. As we drove home, Lauren's phone lit with a message from Jason containing the scenario for her test, and she texted me within the hour asking for a quick call, a request I ignored. Because sometimes the most decisive act of revenge is not interference, but silence. The morning of the test arrived with a tension so heavy it seemed to sink into the air itself, and as I watched the city slowly come alive outside my window, I thought about the message I had sent Lauren the night before, a single line that read, "You don't need me," which looked on its surface like a gesture of encouragement but carried, underneath, the sharp edge of a challenge, because I knew she had built her entire professional persona on the scaffolding of other people's quiet labor, mine. Most of all, and without that invisible support she would finally have to stand on her own unsteady legs. The scenario Jason had given her was not a theoretical case pulled from some old binder, but a genuine, high-stakes client issue, one that required both creativity and structure. And although she had responded with a cheerful thumbs up, she had also sent me a text barely 20 hours later asking for a call, which I had ignored because her failure or success had to come without me rewriting the script in the background. We met in a small conference room at Jason's office, one of those sterile spaces that tries to look inviting with abstract art and poor lighting, but really exists to strip away distraction. And when I walked in with my folder and laptop, Lauren was already seated. Back straight, face painted with the brightness she reserves for auditions, while Mom sat in the lobby pretending to read an old magazine and Dad remained blissfully unaware, thinking we were off having sister time. Jason and Becca entered with the solemn energy of judges at a competition, both carrying notepads, though I doubted they needed them, and after brief introductions, Jason gestured for Lauren to begin. She launched into her presentation with a flourish, opening with bold phrases about brand vision, community building, and long-term trust, her voice steady and her eye contact deliberate, and for a few minutes, she managed to hold the room with sheer charisma. But as soon as the outline required specifics, numbers, milestones, actions that could be implemented within 48 hours, her voice wavered, and she drifted into familiar language about exploring possibilities, engaging ambassadors, and activating momentum, which sounded impressive to an untrained ear, but rang hollow in a room where operations were the only currency that mattered. Jason's face remained neutral, his gift and his weapon, but Becca's pen tapped lightly against her notebook, the sound of a verdict forming before words were spoken, and Lauren concluded with a small, triumphant smile, as if applause might save her from gravity. When it was my turn, I didn't embellish, because embellishment is decoration and decoration is a luxury when something is broken. Instead, I outlined a lean plan that began with triage, a short-term patch that would stabilize the client's workflow within 2 days, followed by a series of structured checkpoints that would capture edge cases and build measurable trust, and I closed with a commitment to transparent communication, promising weekly updates in plain language and direct accountability if promises were not met. It was not glamorous, and I did not raise my voice, but as the words filled the room, I could feel the difference settling over everyone present, the quiet recognition that glamour might inspire, but structure keeps the lights on. When the exercise ended, Jason and Becca left the room to confer, and the silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Lauren turned to me, her expression cracked but still defiant, and told me I enjoyed making her look small, that I had always taken satisfaction in cutting her down, and I replied that I did not enjoy making her look small. I only wanted to stop being made small myself, and those are not the same verbs even if they end in the same shape. She accused me of setting her up with trapdoors, and I reminded her that she had asked for a stage, and gravity is impartial. Mom entered quietly then, her magazine abandoned, and when Lauren turned her anger on her, asking if she too thought Aaron deserved to be chosen, Mom spoke words she had never dared before, admitting that she trusted me more. Not because I was easier to love, but because trust is earned through consistency, and Lauren's volatility, while dazzling, was also exhausting. When Jason and Becca returned, Jason delivered the verdict with the same calm tone he would use to read a weather report, telling Lauren she had exceptional presence and could command any room, but that the role required a builder first, and turning to me, he asked if I would accept the position, stating bluntly that I was already performing it in practice. Lauren smiled tightly and congratulated me with each syllable carved like glass, and Becca softened the blow by telling her they would keep her in mind for a brand role in the future, which was sincere but also salt. I responded by telling them that if Lauren were given such a role, I would vouch for her and build the structure she needed, but only on the condition that there would be no shortcuts, no invisible labor falling onto me without recognition. And Jason nodded slowly, signaling that he understood this was not just about one hire, but about years of unseen work. That night, I returned to my apartment, pulled the lemon cake from my fridge, and sat with the recording app still glowing red, the file labeled with my birthday and holding within it the entire collapse of the family myth. and I hovered over the option to save it or delete it, unable to decide whether I wanted proof of everything or freedom from it. I did not choose either, but I did forward Lauren's application for a brand role out of limbo, sending it forward without promises, because revenge without end is only poison, and then I sent Jason a short message accepting the role. No parade. No celebration, just the decision itself. Later, I texted my father that I had been offered a new position, a larger version of what I already did, and after a long delay, the only word he sent back was proud, without an exclamation or a question mark. Just a single word that felt like a fragile truce. Days later, Lauren texted me a photo of her notebook, filled with bullet points and timelines, ending with a sentence underlined twice that read, "No shortcuts, no asking Aaron," and I laughed out loud. Because for the first time I saw in her not performance, but determination, and perhaps that was the closest thing to resolution we were ever going to get. The truth is I do not know if I won or simply stopped losing, and maybe that is enough, because the story is no longer about who shines brighter, but about who finally stopped pretending the paint on the backdrop was the sky.